everybody. Hello, hello, hello. Hi. Hello. Thank you. Hi, hello. Welcome, welcome. Y'all are still talking, but hello. Yes. Welcome. So if you can take a seat, that would be greatly appreciated. Welcome to our Freedom Fund dinner, and right now we have an hour of lecture that the speaker is going to have. If you are here only for the lecture, we really kindly ask you to leave us later for the dinner, and then you'll have your own dinner wherever you go. So we welcome you for coming here, we welcome you for joining us, and in a few minutes, Jonathan Smith is going to be up here on the stage, so I'm going to read his bio. Jonathan M. Smith was appointed Executive Director of the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Urban Affairs on July 1st, 2016. Immediately prior to joining the committee, Mr. Smith was the Associate Dean of Experiential and Clinical Programs at the University of the District of Columbia, David A. Clark School of Law. Mr. Smith was the Chief of the Special Litigation Section of the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice from 2010 to 2015. The section was responsible for pattern or practice investigations of civil rights violations by law enforcement, correctional, juvenile justice, and mental health and developmental disability agencies. Under his leadership, the section conducted the civil investigation of the Ferguson, Missouri Police Department following the death of Michael Brown. Prior to his government services, Mr. Smith was the Executive Director of the Legal Aid Society of the District of Columbia, the Public Justice Center in Baltimore, Maryland, and the DC Prisoners Legal Services Project. In each of these positions, in addition to providing program leadership, he has handled individual, class action, and impact litigation, engaged in legislative advocacy, and in institutional reform efforts. He started his career as an associate to Virginia civil rights lawyer Victor Glasberg. Pass up left. So please help me welcome to the stage our keynote speaker for right now, Jonathan M. Smith.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. And in some ways, I hate reading my bio because it sounds like I'm either old or I can't keep a job. But thank you. That was a really kind and generous introduction. So when Cliff had approached me about joining you this evening, and I'm tremendously honored for the opportunity to do that, we talked about having an opportunity to, before the dinner, and for those who are going to be here for the dinner, I apologize, you're going to get me twice because I'm going to join you to talk a little bit later as well, hopefully covering different ground. We thought we were going to have, it would be nice to have an opportunity to talk a little bit about the work that the Department of Justice did in Ferguson and some reflections that I have from that work. And I thought it was going to be something of a smaller, more intimate group of people, and I had prepared a PowerPoint which we couldn't get to work this evening. So and maybe we can do a little bit of this tonight. I hope to have a chance to have a bit of a conversation because I think that this work does require dialogue. And while I can stand here for the next 45 minutes, anybody who knows me well will tell you I could stand here for the next 45 minutes without any trouble at all and talk at you. I'd love to know what people are thinking and what work you're doing now and how we can reflect together on what's going on with the crisis in policing in this country and what lessons we can learn from that work. So if people have questions, if you have thoughts, if you have comments, please feel free to stop me. If you don't, I will just go, and hopefully it will provide you with at least some help and some insights about thinking about this work. Now, as my introduction, I was the chief of the Special Litigation Section of the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice. The Special Litigation Section, there are 10 sections in the Civil Rights Division, and most of them if you told them, if you sort of knew the name, you knew what kind of work that they did. You have a voting section and a housing section and an education section, and et cetera, et cetera. Special education section was that portion of the Civil Rights Division which was empowered to enforce the laws that related mostly to the criminal justice system in the United States. And one of the statutes that we enforced was a statute that was enacted in the wake of the disturbances in Los Angeles when the officers who beat Rodney King had been acquitted in the state court. And at that time, you had one statute with the federal government, one way in which the federal government could get at problems in policing in this country. And that was a criminal statute. And that was a criminal statute in which the United States could prosecute a police officer who had willfully violated someone's civil rights. And for those of you who know a little about the law, willfulness is the highest possible standard of the law, and the prosecutions under that statute were rare. But more importantly, they didn't get at what were sort of fundamental problems in police departments that didn't rise to the level of criminal conduct, but were critical to ensuring equity, fairness, justice, and compliance with the Constitution of policing. And in 1992, the statute was enacted, which gave the Attorney General the authority to bring litigation against police departments to correct patterns and practices of the violation of the Constitution and federal law in law enforcement. And that was the law that my section was charged to enforce. And that law had been in place for some 20 or so years by the time I took my position. And I think it was largely deemed to be a statute that had not met its promise. If you look across policing in the United States, you would see in community after community inequity in the way the laws were being enforced. You saw excessive patterns of excessive use of force, and we're going to talk about that in Ferguson. You saw disparities in the way that stops and arrests were conducted. You saw mistrust between particularly communities of color and police departments. You saw a lot of other kinds of discrimination that was occurring in policing, and the law had not reached it. So we undertook in the last administration to spend some time thinking about what it was the federal government's role in attempting to try to address what was going on in police departments across the country. There are 18,000 police departments in the United States, a lot of police departments in the United States, and the vast majority of them operate, about 50% of them are under 50 police officers, and the vast majority of them operate with very little supervision at the state or local level, and certainly very little at the federal level. And so the first case that I had the chance to work on, or the honor to work on, was the investigation of the New Orleans Police Department. And we started thinking about the work that we did beginning in New Orleans, and I was glad that we had done that work, because when we talk about Ferguson in a minute, and I'll get to it very quickly, we had actually done a lot of thinking about what the federal government role was and how we could play that role. Previously, the work of the federal government in terms of investigating police departments had largely been focused on a very hyper-technical review of a police department. It had looked at sort of what was the policies of the department, and how do they do the training, and what was the ways in which the various systems work. But it didn't engage the communities that were most likely to encounter police departments. It didn't engage the communities that were most likely to be policed. And the innovation that we brought during the last administration, and I'm sad to say this administration has not followed through, the innovation we brought to the last administration was to really change that dynamic. And we spent as much time working to learn what the experience of people who were policed were, as we looked at what the role and the experience of people who were doing policing. And that proved to be an incredibly important strategy in Ferguson. Now, if I had my slides, at this point I would put up one of those iconic photographs. I think we all remember when the uprising happened in Ferguson after the wake of Michael Brown's death. And I would put up one of those slides that shows a young African-American man standing in that street where the protests were happening in Ferguson with his hands up in the air, and with a police line, and you see the police officers in their full uniform and face masks and shields and automatic weapons. and the heavy militarization of that street, and the demonstrators that were there that were protesting what had happened in Ferguson, Missouri. And I think that that is what, when we all think about Ferguson, is our first image. And when you think about what happened there, we think about the uprising that happened in the wake of what happened to Michael Brown and Michael Brown's death. But the story of Ferguson is actually a very different story than that. That's not an unimportant part of what happened. But that was in a response to something that was deeper, more profound, more insidious, and more damaging to the community. And when I think of what the image of Ferguson, I would show you the next slide if I had my slides to show you, is a picture of the courthouse in Ferguson, the municipal courthouse in Ferguson. And coming out of that municipal courthouse is a long line of people of color. And that is the story of Ferguson that I think we don't know, and we don't talk about, and we don't tell. Because that is what happened prior to Michael Brown's death that created the pressure cooker that blew up. We had a criminal legal system in Ferguson, Missouri, and all throughout Missouri, and candidly all across the United States. If I had my slides, the little refrain, the very last slide I would show you is a map of the United States with the word Ferguson written in hundreds of places across it. Because what happened in Ferguson, while was different, was not unique. It's happening in communities and towns all across the United States. So when I went in to do work in most communities, one of the things that was important to me, we were coming from Washington, we were the federal government, we're here to help. We came in from Washington. It was important to begin to understand before we began an investigation, particularly if we're going to try to understand and interact and reflect the voices of people in the community who have been harmed by policing practices. It was important to understand those communities. And so I always spent a little time doing a little bit of research, trying to understand what was going on in the community. And Ferguson was actually a really interesting place. Ferguson is in St. Louis County. It's some 20 miles north of St. Louis. I don't know, maybe people in the room had spent some time at the demonstrations or done work around Ferguson and been there. It's a community that was, until the 1960s, was what was called a sundown town. People know what a sundown town is. A sundown town, it was literally illegal for a person of color, an African American, black person, to be on the streets of Ferguson after sundown unless you were unless you're a domestic servant accompanied by your employer. You could not be on the streets until the 1960s in Ferguson. You would be arrested, subject to arrest, if you were a black person who was walking on the streets unless you were a domestic servant in the accompanied by your employer. They would close off the streets in and out of town at night to keep African Americans out. There was a community, do people know the case of Shelley versus Kramer, the case about restrictive covenants that Thurgood Marshall argued in 1948 in the United States Supreme Court, where they found that it was illegal to put in your deed that you couldn't sell the home to an African American. Throughout this country, we have thousands and thousands of deeds. If most of us look at our deed, you'll probably see a covenant that says you can only sell your home to white people. And this case went to the United States Supreme Court. The wonderful play, Raisin in the Sun, was based on this case, Shelley versus Kramer. That house, the house that was the subject of that lawsuit that went to the United States Supreme Court, was 6 miles from Ferguson, Missouri. So there is a deep sense of sort of racial bias that is embedded in that community. In 1960, you essentially had an all-white community. You had a few people who lived in, African Americans who lived in people's homes as servants. By 1990, 20% of the community in Ferguson had become African American. And that was largely as a result of the fact that you had school desegregation decree, which had imposed desegregation throughout St. Louis County. And the Supreme Court had said that you couldn't create a unitary school district outside of a school district, so they confined desegregation to St. Louis City. And African American families moved into the county to get a better education for their children. By 2014, 67% of the city of Ferguson was African American. And you would think that that kind of transformation would have changed the politics of the city. You would think that you had gone from a community in 1960 that was 100% white to a community that was a majority African American community. That would have changed the power in the community. You would have seen a different sort of equity. But what we saw when we went into Ferguson was that you had never had or any meaningful African American participation in local government. It was 100% run, white-run local government. And that even the schools, despite the fact that you had this changing demographic, the school districts were drawn such that the African American community, all the students went to schools that were almost 100% African American, and the white students went to schools that were almost 100% white. The city remained a racially segregated city. And it was the school that Michael Brown attended was so underfunded and so poorly run that it was actually decertified by the state. And so you had this incredible different reality between where the African American community lived and where students in the white community would live. And one of the things that I have to say that was most telling to me when we started the investigation, I had an opportunity to meet with the mayor and the chief of police and the city manager as we began our investigation at Ferguson. And one of the things, and this was most telling, was that as we sat with them, they said two things to me which sort of suggested to me that I had a pretty good idea what we were going to find once we did the investigation. We did a genuine investigation. We didn't reach a conclusion before we started. But I had a pretty good idea where we were going to go. They said two things to me. The first thing they said to me, this was the first time we'd been to Ferguson. I had not had a chance to tour the town and see the community. They said, you know, the African American community, you had essentially the housing segregation was such that in the African American community, people lived in largely apartment complexes, low-rise apartments, what we call garden apartments in the main. Where Michael Brown was, they were a little bit more high-rise, but most of the apartments were relatively low-rise. And whites lived largely in single-family homes. And the mayor talked about how when he went to school, the bus that he was in would drive past the African American community as he was going. He was a incredibly young guy. He had been in school within 10 years prior to becoming mayor. And he said he talked about how he would duck down below the windows so he wouldn't get shot when they drove through the schools. But that was the attitude of the mayor of a town where 2/3 of his community was African American. The other thing that they said, and we heard throughout the entire investigation, was that, and we'll talk about this in a second, but they said, you're going to see a lot of stuff. You're going to look at a lot of statistics. You're going to come up with a lot of numbers, and you're going to see that what happens to African Americans in this community is different than what happens to white people. And you're going to say that we're racists. But we're not. We're not racists. What's really going on is that the people in the African American community, and this is code language if I've ever heard it, lack personal responsibility. And we heard that over and over again. I heard that from the chief, I heard that from the command staff, I heard that from the mayor, I heard that from the city manager. And it was fairly clear from the beginning that that was the way that they viewed what went on. So Ferguson sits in St. Louis County. There's 90 jurisdictions in St. Louis County. About 50 of them have their own police departments and their own municipal courts. Ferguson is a relatively small town. It's about 20,000 people, 21,000 people. And so why does a town of 21,000 people in a county that has its own police department and its own courts need its own police department and its own courts? You have county courts. You could take your criminal cases there. You have county police that could patrol your streets and provide public safety in your community. Why would you want your own police department? Well, throughout St. Louis and throughout lots of America, but Missouri is one of those states, the municipal court is the primary source of revenue for the city. It's a place in which, under Missouri law, you can enact a local code in which you can adopt all of the criminal laws of the state and add criminal laws of your own, in which you can then bring people before your municipal court, and any fines, fees, and court debt that you secure the result of those criminal cases go into the coffers of the city. City of Ferguson had an $11 million budget. What you saw during the Great Recession was that you saw land values go down, so tax revenues declined. And in response to that, the city started to see its court as an ATM. You saw that the court became the mechanism through which the city was able to secure revenue for city operations. Rather than raise taxes, they criminalized the people. So in 2010, the court was bringing in $1.4 million. By 2014, it was $2.6 million. And they had budgeted $3.1 million in the budget for 2015, just before Michael Brown had died. And what was sort of stunning to us was how nakedly the city had undertaken this process of looking at its court as a way to raise revenue. We got, surprisingly, we got every email that was sent inside the, using a government, Ferguson Ferguson email account, with a Ferguson email, and so we had all the emails between the chief of police and the mayor and the city manager and the court clerk and the finance director of the city. And in searching all of those emails, we found a plethora of emails about using the court and the police as a way to raise revenue. We saw them talk about, there was emails to the chief that said, you know, next month, if you could get the tickets that are written up by 7%, then we'll be able to make our budget. And the chief writing back, oh no, we can get them up by 10% or 15%. You saw all this communication back and forth about how the court would raise revenue with the clerk and with the other city officials. What you didn't see, much to our surprise, was a single email about public safety. There wasn't a single email that says, people are running that stop sign and kids are in danger of getting run over or getting hit. We need to put a police officer there to stop people from running that stop sign. We didn't see a single email about a problem corner or difficulty at a business or any other thing. What we saw was a city that was obsessed with using its courts to raise revenue. And it did things, in addition to this focus that had a dramatic negative impact on the city. It raised its fines to a level that was almost unsustainable. If you got a parking ticket in Ferguson, it was $102. If you failed to put enough quarters in the parking meter, it was a $102 ticket. If you got a parking ticket, if I get a parking ticket in my community, I can usually go online and pay it, or I can send a check somewhere, or there's a window at the police department I can go pay. Not in Ferguson. You had to show up in court. And the court only met twice a week in the afternoon. And 500 people would be there. And that line I was talking about, those would be people that would queue out into the parking lot. The day that I went to observe court, there were 500 people there. It was a very hot day. It gets hot in Missouri. People were standing in the parking lot waiting for their chance to get in front of a judge to pay their parking tickets. If you didn't show up, then you would be, there'd be a failure to appear, there'd be another fine. It would stack up, it would stack up. If you couldn't pay your parking tickets, if you got 3 or 4 or 5 and you couldn't afford to pay them, then you'd be put on a payment plan in which there was 1 day a month. For 2 hours, there was a window open at the courthouse you could go. One of my lawyers on my team observed a woman dragging 2 small children rushing in to pay her ticket at the end of that time period and having the window closed in her face. And when that happened, a failure to appear was issued for her. $75 more was added, and a warrant was issued for her arrest. There's never a lawyer in this court. We never saw lawyers in this court. While the judge says, I've never sentenced anybody to jail for a parking ticket or any of the municipal fines, hundreds and hundreds of people were sent to jail because they couldn't pay their fines. We talked to one woman, and she was not unique, but I will never forget her. One woman who twice, on 2 separate occasions, she didn't put enough coins in the parking meter. She got $202 tickets. She couldn't pay them. By the time we encountered her, that had grown to $1,600. She had paid about $500 of it. She'd been jailed several times. As a result of her being jailed, she lost her job, and her kids were placed in foster care. So for failing to have enough quarters on 2 separate occasions, she paid the price of having lost her employment, essentially becoming homeless, and her kids were placed in foster care. And that was the cost of the system that was set up to raise revenue. It was a system that was set up to drag people into the system and then to keep them there. But what was, there was 2 parts I said earlier to this story of Ferguson. The first was a criminal legal system that had been transformed from one that was designed to address public safety to one that was designed to raise revenue. But it wasn't designed to raise revenue from everybody. It was only designed to raise revenue from the African American community. And so when we started to look at what was going on, we saw that there were dramatic disparities about who it was. If you went into that courtroom on that night and you hung out and watched who was appearing, every face was a face of color. There was a small Hispanic community, Latinx community in Ferguson. It's mostly African American. But you rarely ever saw a white person appear in front of that court. In Ferguson, a town of 21,000 people, in 2009, just to give you some kind of context, the city wrote 24,000 traffic tickets and 20,000 non-traffic tickets. Non-traffic tickets were things like failing to cut your grass, not having a derelict car in your yard, other sort of minor non-traffic offenses. By 2014, that had grown to 53,000 traffic tickets and 50,000 non-traffic tickets. They made 11,000 vehicle stops during a 2-year period, and we couldn't find out how many pedestrian stops they made because they didn't track their pedestrian stops in any way that we could identify them. So when we looked at what the data was, try to understand the racial impact of what the Ferguson Police Department was doing, we found that 85%, well, there's 67% of the population was African American, 85% of the stops were African American, 90% of the citations, and 93% of the arrests were people who are African American. And so now don't shoot the messenger on this one. The law actually doesn't when we looked at that, the law actually doesn't help us very much with those statistics. There are a bunch of cases out there in which the Supreme Court says, not the Supreme Court, it hasn't gotten to the Supreme Court yet, where courts have said, just showing that there's a difference between what's going with demographics and who gets arrested doesn't actually help us very much to understand whether there's a violation of the Constitution because, and again, this is not me, this is the court has concluded that it's possible that people of different races offend at different rates. And so you have to actually go, and again, this is a challenge we had to face. We had to show that beyond that there was intent in the way that the officers conducted their policing activities in order to prove that there was discrimination. It wasn't enough just to show that there was differences because, and the chief made this argument to us all the time, well, because of economic differences, it's more likely we're going to pull over a car with an African American in it because they're more likely to not fix their headlights because they don't have the money. And that we heard all that sort of stuff. So we had to attempt to try to triangulate. We had to try to find other indicia that would help us understand what was on the mind of police officers when they pulled people over. So we looked at ways to, and we had, incredible statisticians that helped us. We looked at ways to try to understand the data from a variety of different perspectives. So we looked at who got searched in Ferguson, and we found that African Americans, if you were stopped either on the street as a pedestrian or in your car, if you're African American, you're twice as likely to get searched. And that's a pretty significant difference, twice as likely to get searched. But we also found that the searches of African Americans were vastly less productive than the searches of white people. if you were a white person searched, they were 26% more likely to find contraband on you than a search of an African American. So they were not identified. They were searching African Americans, and a lot of those searches were not productive. The city had a practice, and in fact, it was almost a competition between police officers as to how many tickets you could write on an individual stop. We had these reports where officers would write as many as 13 or 14. They'd pull somebody over because there was a cracked windshield or there was a taillight that was out. And then they would search the car looking for any other possible reason to write a ticket. Sometimes as many as 13 or 14 tickets. The younger officers in particular would compete with each other as to who could write the most tickets on a single stop. And they come back at the end of their shift and they would brag about it. In the period between 2012 and 2014, we found that 73 African Americans got 4 or more tickets on a single stop, and only 2 white people got 4 or more tickets on a single stop. We also tried to understand through the kind of conduct that officers were engaged in, it was discretionary conduct. We looked at what happened with discretionary charges. Michael Brown was engaging in a crime called manner of walking in roadway. That's the crime under the Municipal Code of Ferguson called manner of walking right when he was killed by Darren Wilson. Now I want to just say one thing here. My investigation was entirely separate from the criminal investigation of whether Darren Wilson murdered Michael Brown or not. We were walled off from that was handled by criminal prosecutors. We looked entirely at the civil investigation. When the Attorney General charged us to conduct the investigation, he says, I want you to look at everything that happened right up to Michael Brown's death. We looked a little bit at the way the police responded to the demonstrations because there was some pretty horrible stuff that happened there. That's a little outside of our jurisdiction, but we got away with it. But a different section looked at what happened with Darren Wilson and Michael Brown. And so I can't comment much more than what's in the public record about that. But Michael Brown was essentially jaywalking. And we found that 93% of the people who had been charged with that crime, manner of walking the roadway, were African American. 94% of a crime called failure to comply, which almost all of the time was a police officer would walk up to someone and say, give me your identification, and the person would say no. About 94% were African American. And if you were observed speeding and they used radar, as compared to observed speeding where they followed you, the radar readings, there was a 48% disparity in the use of discretionary observation. So if you have an objective measure like radar, and you had a subjective measure like following somebody, African Americans are 48%, almost 50% more likely to be stopped for where it was not an objective measure. So you saw these dramatic disparities, and you saw that the system was designed to both capture people and then keep them in and charge them. 94% of the arrests are African American. I go on. I've got a large number of statistics here, and I will not bore you with all of them. But we didn't just see it with the stop and arrest data, and there's other ways in which we attempted to triangulate to show the stop and arrest data that the community was targeted by the police. We also saw it with regard to use of force, and when we went in to the police department, we were surprised to learn that the shooting death of Michael Brown, when you saw what happened in the streets after Michael Brown's death, the shooting of Michael Brown was actually pretty uncommon in the city of Ferguson. It had been more than 10 years since there had been an officer-involved shooting in Ferguson. That the rebellion was not about cops shooting people. There were other very, very horrible shootings in St. Louis County, and particularly in St. Louis City. There have been a number of pretty serious shootings in St. Louis City. But that was not what was going on in Ferguson. But we did find that there were significant disparities in the use of force. We found that force was Most frequently, almost 90% of the time, was used against African Americans. Again, another disparity. But we saw that the force, particularly things where the force was a higher level use of force, like use of tasers. And we saw, examples of use of tasers under circumstances that are pretty shocking, where you would, in many cases, the circumstances where there was a failure to comply with a lawful order of a police officer, what the person was ultimately charged with, which was often started with a police officer walking up to somebody. As we know, Darren Wilson's first words with Michael Brown were a curse word. It was used and then says, cursed him out, and it said, come over here. And we heard from mostly young men, but from people throughout the community, young African American, and that's the way every police encounter started, was with a curse word. And frequently that was followed by show me your ID. And if you didn't, we found time and time again people had a taser used against them. We found that Ferguson, even though it was a relatively small department, had a canine unit. They had dogs. I got 5 minutes? Okay, I will hurry up then. We found that the dogs were used to bite over a 2-year period. The dogs were used to bite 14 times. Every one of them was African American, including a 13-year-old boy who was a truant from school. And when the police were called, because he was truant from school, he was in a closet, they sent the dog in to drag him out. And when you think about the symbolism of the use of dogs in the civil rights movement, it was significant to us. We saw other uses of force. And this created in the community this combination of the draining money out of people's pockets, the racial disparities, the use of force. It created an incredible pressure cooker in that community. People were afraid to drive because if you had an outstanding ticket and you got pulled over, you were going to go to jail. And because Ferguson was one of the small communities, and there were dozens of other small communities who were doing exactly the same thing in St. Louis County, you might go on what they called the Muni Shuffle, where you'd spend 2 or 3 days in the jail in Ferguson, then you go to the next place and spend 2 or 3 days there. You might spend 2 or 3 days somewhere else, all for these very minor offenses that had grown to this exaggerated sums because these communities were draining money out of the pocket of African Americans. And it created, one of the things that we also were surprised about was that you had a community where you had 2/3 of the community was African American, and every elected official for as long as anybody can remember was white. We asked people, what's going on with that? We're interested to know why is there voter suppression going on? Are people prevented from voting? Are people not allowed to register to vote? Is it because of felony disenfranchisement? And time again, we heard from people, I don't want to go down to the polling place because I have an outstanding ticket and I don't want to get arrested. People didn't exercise the franchise. They were prevented from exercising the franchise because they were afraid of the impact it would have on their lives. And so, in closing, and there's a lot more to talk about, it was about Ferguson and what it means for us as a country, and I do think you see this all over the country. In closing, I mentioned earlier that we heard from all of the public officials, we heard from the police, we heard from a lot of community leaders that the real reason why we saw these disparities was because black people were irresponsible, they didn't fix their cars and they didn't pay their tickets and all that sort of stuff. We were shocked, candidly, that people didn't understand what kind of code language that actually was, and that they thought that was somehow persuasive in the defense of their conduct. But one of the things that we learned after we issued our report, we wrote a report, and I hope it's publicly available. It's actually been published in book form, and we attempted to capture in that report the voices of people in the community and the impact that it had, as well as sort of describing what was wrong and what our remedy might be. And we worked really hard. I think the team of folks, I can't take very little credit for it, but the team of folks who wrote that report did a really remarkable job in telling those stories of people who were impacted by these police practices. And we issued our report. The Attorney General issued the report, and we went in Ferguson and we started the process of trying to negotiate a court order that would fix the Ferguson Police Department. And 2 days later, one of the local media outlets found something that we had missed. The judge that sat in the court in Ferguson, and he sat 2 days a week there and 2 days a week other places, other counties. He was on a circuit. The judge that sat there that had caused that woman that I talked about earlier to lose her kids and spend some time in jail, that his decisions had caused thousands of people to spend time in jail, thousands of people to be afraid to vote, thousands of people to be literally afraid to be on the streets. He owed the federal government $170,000 in back taxes. And so I gotta ask you, if you're worried about personal responsibility, who is it that doesn't display personal responsibility? And so it really was, I guess one final thing I want to say that I skipped over my notes. One of the things about getting the emails that was remarkable to us, there were two things really that were remarkable to us about getting emails. I talked earlier about the fact that there was very little about public safety, and there was a lot about money. The other thing, there was actually a lot of what one of my colleagues quaintly called the naked ladies. That was throughout the email. But there were two other things that we saw. One was that there wasn't that white people never got pulled over for traffic tickets. It's that white people had mechanisms to get rid of them without going to court and having to suffer these consequences. We found emails where people would, my cousin, wouldn't it be a shame if my poor cousin had to pay this $200 traffic ticket? And the clerk of courts would write back and says, we'll take care of that. And those are folks, and we saw that coming through the mayor and other public officials, taking care of the tickets for white kids that got picked up because they were speeding or they ran a stop sign or something like that. And the other thing that we saw, which was actually more disturbing, if you can imagine after all of this, more disturbing, some of the most horrific racist efforts at humor I've ever seen. And some of the things that were circulated between public officials, there were some of the most horrifying racism that I've ever seen on paper. And it really, while it itself doesn't prove what we tend to prove, I think our investigation did a much better job. It did demonstrate the callousness of a community where your leaders on their public email would circulate things that I can't even describe in this room because they just were horrifying. And so I think that as we think about what happened in Ferguson, it's important to think about the specifics of what happened in that community, the way in which the mechanisms of injustice were very carefully calculated to target only the African American community, very carefully calculated to entrap the African American community in a criminal legal system, and to essentially make it impossible for people to get out, to drain people's pocketbooks. But I think it's also important to know and to think that about the lessons to be learned about the rest of our country. I think that as we look in every community, we're going to see some version of what's going on in Ferguson. And one of the things that, while it's unique, but the specifics of Ferguson are unique, the general lesson is not unique. We see a system, we see a country, and I'll talk in my dinner presentation a little bit more about some of the ways in which that came about, but we see a country in which we have designed our system to achieve a specific result. And it is achieving that result. It's often, I often get criticized for using the word reform when I talk about the criminal legal system, because it's not a question of actual reform, it's a question of change. Because this system is not broken, it is actually doing what it was designed to do. And we need to think very, very differently as we understand the way in which race plays an overriding role in the way we police, the way we incarcerate in our carceral system. It's critically important for us to be able to understand that and to not try to fix it, but to make it different. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Let's give one more round of applause for Mr. Smith. How was it?
Wonderful.
Okay, good. All right. So now I would like to thank everybody that showed up for the lecture part only. And as you exit, we would like to let you know that we would love to have your name and email address so we can stay in community and in contact with you. So please, you can see Liz or Sarah in the back to do that. She's waving already. And if you are here for the dinner portion of our evening, take a moment, get up, stretch, meet some new people, make sure you're at the right table, you know, get some drink, get some water, go to the bathroom, all of the above. And then in a few minutes, we're gonna have appetizer in the back, and then we'll come back and start our formal part of the evening. Okay? And you can talk to Mr. Smith if you like. All right, so discuss, people.
So first and foremost, before I say anything, I would like to offer a few thanks to a few different entities and individuals. And also accessibility check. Can everyone hear me? Okay. I'm sort of leaning. Let's do this. So first and foremost, I would like to introduce our executive committee. The first person I'd like to introduce is Clifford L. Wood. He is our education chair. The next person is Rose Albert. She serves as first vice president to the branch. The next person is Representative Nader Hashim. He serves as second vice president to the branch. After that, we have Clifford Orenberger. I think you're in the back. Clifford serves as our treasurer. After that, we have Sarah Wiggins Donovan, also in the back. Look for the red hair. She is our secretary. And then right after that, there is Elizabeth Zinn Williams. And she currently serves as our assistant secretary. I would also like to take this time to thank a couple volunteers of distinction. When I call your name, I would like for you to stand if able. If unable, raise your hand or let out a yell or whatever you are able to do so that you can be recognized. The first one is Myra Tangatarova. Please stand, Myra. The branch thanks Myra for her steadfast friendship and support. The second person is our education chair, Clifford L. Wood. We thank him for his mentorship, guidance, and leadership. The next is Miss Lyndall Bowl. We thank Lyndall for her unwavering support, wisdom, and for believing in us when we first started out. The next is Jamie Contois. We thank her for her stellar outreach skills and for her allyship. The next is Donna Maycumber. We thank her for her ear and wise advice. We have Mary Hill that is next, and I do not think she's with us tonight. She's out in California, and that is why we thank her for her support from close and afar. She's seasonal, y'all. She knows how to do it right. The next is Ann Schroeder, who also cannot be with us tonight. We expected her to be here, but she's unable. We thank her for her awesome policy analysis. She is the policy wonk on the team, and she always tells us exactly what we need to know when we need to know it. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Miss Diana Wally. for helping our branch to grow and thrive. We would also like to thank our sponsors. We have 4 main sponsors. You can see them on the back of the brochure or program. Sorry, not a brochure. It could be. Give it out. The first one is our beloved sister branch, Rutland, the Rutland branch of the NAACP. There are only 2 branches in Vermont, and we are ride or die for each other. Sister branch is in the fight. The next is Brattleboro Memorial Hospital, the Episcopal Church of Vermont, and Fenton Family Dealership in Keene, New Hampshire. So, I am so glad that you are all here, and that I have the privilege to serve as president of this branch and to address you all tonight. I'd like to begin with a short but powerful statement from my grandmother, a Miss Alice Mason, who I adore. She said this to me as I prepared one morning for my first internship at the Madison County Courthouse in Southern Illinois. She said, "Stefan, black people do not get the same opportunity to make mistakes sometimes, so you have to make the right decisions if you want to be somebody." At that time, I did not understand the power in her statement, but I do now. Black men are unarguably the most disenfranchised group in the United States, and black women are the most disempowered. While many others look at our legal system, our judicial system, our education system, our healthcare system with democratic pride and joy, many in the black and brown community view these same systems with a fear that is perpetuated by long-standing intergenerational trauma. We know all about the corruption that thrives in some police departments, the unfair guilty verdicts passed down in the courts, the lynchings, the segregation, the astronomically high birth mortality rate for black women, and the school-to-prison pipeline that brings the pain, so much pain, of mass incarceration to our communities. We know the real consequences that making a mistake may bring, and that seemingly small choices, such as picking the wrong school, the wrong doctor, or the wrong neighborhood to live in, can lead to our ruin. It was and is the mutual disdain of these oppressive systems that brought about the NAACP in 1909, and more than 100 years later, keeps it thriving today. The organization was created by a group of black folks and their white allies who banded together, hand in hand, to say enough is enough, and to begin chipping away at the mass structural and societal injustice facing all communities of color. Now, more than 100 years later, the NAACP consists of 2,100 branches and over 500,000 or 500,000 members, making it the largest and most powerful civil rights organization in the United States. And after more than 108 years, alongside my co-president, Tabitha Moore, now Tabitha Moore, apologies, president of our sister branch in Rutland, we have found our way to southern Vermont. Can we get a hand for our sister branch? Stand up, stand up. Yeah. Sister branch, not y'all, not y'all. That was my bad. Since the inception of the Windham branch, we have hit the ground running, making our presence known by helping to build systemic and societal change in a multitude of areas, such as fair and impartial policing, hate crime and bias reporting, the reference of slavery in the Vermont Constitution, and by pushing for the establishment of the first ever Executive Director of Racial Equity for the state, for diversity in the state of Vermont. We were there. At the local level, we steadfastly help individuals from a multitude of backgrounds experiencing discrimination by going to the police departments on their behalf and advocating for their interests. We also help community leaders in towns such as Putney, Vermont, establish diversity committees, as well as their first diversity committee actually, as well as higher institutions or higher learning institutions such as Landmark College. Actually, they just have a new diversity coordinator. Mark, would you stand up? Yes. He just started. He's making great impact. Actually, all of his students stand up. It's a lot of y'all in here, ain't it? Where y'all at? Put your hands up. Though we take the time to laugh and celebrate tonight, we must also keep in mind that the fight is far from over. We have a president, and in turn a federal government, that wishes to reduce our love and compassion for one another and separate us all by race, religion, creed, able-bodiedness, sexual preference, and so on. And we cannot let this happen. He calls those of Latinx descent rapists. He mocks the intelligence of blacks and Asians. He puts down women and disabled people. He revels in anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim language. And most terrifying of all, he has called upon his brethren with similar beliefs, the everyday citizens among us, to join him in his mission. For this reason, I believe we're at a time in our history where we can all heed the words of my grandmother, because we are living in a time in which none of us can afford to make silly mistakes, lest we all meet a collective demise. We must remember our humanity and commitment to justice for everyone, and we must do it hand in hand and strategically. We must be smart, we must make good decisions, and we must do it in solidarity if we, as a society and a people, want to be somebody. In the wise words of Nelson Mandela, may our choices reflect our hopes and not our fears. Amen. For those reasons and many more, the theme of our dinner tonight is making up for lost time. We hope that you have a wonderful night, and we thank you again for choosing to come to our first annual Freedom Fund dinner. Now I introduce, thank you. Thank you so much. It's so cool to be here. Our executive committee is almost all under 30, or we just turned 30, so we're the youngest in the East Coast, maybe the nation. With that, I would like to also introduce Representative Nader Hashim.
All right, hello everybody. So my role here tonight is to identify and introduce a number of special guests we have in attendance. But before I do that, I mean, he just got quite the round of applause, but I just want to take a quick moment and just shine the spotlight on Stefan one more time, because I think I speak for the entire executive committee that, working with you is really wonderful, and you've done an amazing job of organizing not just this chapter, but this event tonight. So thank you for your leadership. So moving on from that, call me a little biased if you wish, but I'm going to start by recognizing the legislators that we have in the room. I'm pretty sure they're all grouped together in the back over there. They tend to gravitate together. But with us tonight we have Senator Ballant, we have Senator White, we also have Representatives Long, Murwicki, and Coffey. And am I leaving anybody out? I think we got all the legislators, right? And we also have with us Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman. And I'd also like to note that we do have a candidate for governor here tonight, Rebecca Holcomb. Thank you for coming down here. And outside the State House, we have with us Attorney Julio Thompson. We also have Major Ingrid Jonas and Lieutenant Anthony French from the Vermont State Police. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the work you do as well. We also have a representative from Senator Sanders' office, Beth Iwati. Did I pronounce that correctly? I'm sorry. Thanks for coming down. And we also have individuals here representing a number of higher education organizations as well as social and racial justice groups. They are Landmark College, Marlborough College, and Antioch University of New England. We also have folks from the Roots Center for Social Justice. The Community Equity Collaborative, and also Rights and Democracy. And also, if I missed anyone or any organizations, I'm very, very sorry. We are grateful that each and every one of you are here, so thank you. And we also have two specific guests who I will be introducing. You'll be hearing from both of them tonight. With us we have Kaya Morris, who is a former state representative from Bennington and who has advocated continuously for social and racial justice both inside and outside the State House. And today she continues that work by hosting workshops, presentations, and consultations across the country. And we're very thankful to have her here with us tonight. And now I'd also like to introduce another special guest that we have, Bishop McVane Brown, who, as many of you may know, she recently became the first black female bishop of Vermont. And prior to becoming bishop, she spent decades interweaving multi-faith solutions with social justice in both rural and urban communities. We're very grateful that she is now a Vermonter after having moved here from Indiana. Tonight she'll be performing an invocation for us, and we appreciate the time that you've taken to come down here. So, without further delay, I will hand over the mic to you.
Well, it's certainly good to be here. I was very happy when I was asked by Stefan to participate in this evening and to be part of something new that this new chapter is doing. And I'd almost forgotten this, and I love to see, so many of my people here, Episcopalians, I mean, all people are my people, but really my people, the people that drew me here to this state. But Episcopalians have been involved with the NAACP for a very long time. The church where I was rector of in Detroit, St. Matthew's, and it was a merged parish eventually, but originally St. Matthew's, which is the oldest African American Episcopal church in the Episcopal Church. Their ministry was the Underground Railroad, and one of the ministries that they were very active in establishing was the first chapter of the NAACP in Detroit. And the priest and senior warden, so that's the head lay leader of the congregation, came together and met, and they started the NAACP for the whole city. So that's great to be part of that, and thanks for that Motown music. Made me feel right at home. I won't start dancing. I would have had some partners over there. Well, maybe we will. We'll see. But anyway, so before we get started, I'm going to say a prayer for this evening, and then also for our food. Almighty God, giver of all good things, we thank you for the natural majesty and beauty of this land. They restore us, though we often destroy them. Heal us. We thank you for the great resources of this nation. They make us rich, though we often exploit them. Forgive us. We thank you for all people who have made this country strong. They are models for us, though we often fall short of them. Inspire us. We thank you for the torch of liberty which has been lit in this land. It is drawn from every nation, though we have often hidden from its light. Enlighten us. We thank you for the faith we have inherited and all its rich variety. It sustains our life, though we have been faithless again and again. Renew us. Help us, O God, to finish the good work here begun. Strengthen our efforts to blot out ignorance and prejudice, and to abolish poverty and crime, and hasten the day when all our people, with many voices and one united chorus, will glorify your holy name. Amen. Amen. And now a prayer for our food. We thank you for the food that we will share, for the people whose labor cultivated the plants and animals we will call a meal, and for the nutrients they'll provide. We are grateful for and ask a blessing for the hands that have prepared this feast. And our gratitude, keep us always mindful and responsive to the needs of others. Amen. Amen.
Please stand and raise your voices and lift up your voice and sing.
Without further ado, if you can give the musical people your attention, they will be performing for you. Mr. Paul, the floor is
People get ready, there's a train a-comin'. You don't need no ticket, you just get on board. All you need is faith to feel that diesel humming. You don't need no luggage, you just thank the Lord. People get ready for the train to freedom, picking up passengers from coast to coast. Faith is the key, open the door and boredom. There's hope for all among this loving host. Don't want no neutrals hanging round the track, coming to me and saying they won't go, 'cause everybody loves freedom, everybody, this I know. People get ready, there's a train a-comin'.
Time is built on swift transition. No summer can move consent. Build your hopes on things eternal and hold to God's unchanging hand. Hold to His hand, God's unchanging hand. Hold to His hand, God's unchanging hand. Build your hopes on things eternal and hold to God's unchanging hand.
Trust in Him who will not leave you, whatsoever years may bring. If your earthly friends forsake you, still more closely to Him cling. Hold to His hand, God's unchanging hand. You gotta hold to His hand, God's unchanging hand. Build your hopes on things eternal and hold to God's unchanging hand. Fill our hearts with true thanksgiving. Bless our loved ones everywhere. Friends on earth and friends in heaven. Keep them in your loving care. Hold to His hand, God's unchanging hand. Hold to His hand, God's unchanging hand. Build your hopes on things eternal and hold to God's unchanging. Hold to God's unchanging. Hold to God's unchanging. Hold to God's unchanging. Hold to God's unchanging hand.
Thank you, Paul. So when Cliff Woods here asked me, I'm the music director at St. Michael's Episcopal Church, and Cliff kindly asked me if I'd do some music here tonight, and I said, well, I'd be honored, but I really want to involve some of the members of my choir school because I'm so proud of them. And I wanted them to have this experience too, being here and hearing the speakers tonight and just being part of this. So these 8 young people are 8 out of about 30 kids who take part in a wider choir program. which is offered free of charge by our church to the community. So a lot of the kids who do this program, especially in the younger groups, aren't church members. They just come to sing and to be together in community. So these 8 many of them have been with me since the start 3 or 4 years ago, and I'm so proud of them. So I'll just introduce them. We have Nathaniel here, Callan, Marion, Jane, Ellie, Caleb, Jonah, and Clara. So I'm so delighted. And my husband, Paul.
Paul and Silas were bound in jail, had no money for to go their bill. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. And Paul and Silas began to shout, jail doors open and they walked out. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, hold on. The only thing that we did wrong was staying in the wilderness too long. And keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, hold on. And the only thing that we did right was the day we started to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, hold on. I got my hand on the freedom plow, wouldn't take nothing for my journey now. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. And freedom's name is mighty sweet, and black and white are gonna meet. And keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on.
Sinner, do you love your Jesus? Sinner, do you love your Jesus? Sinner, do you love your Jesus? Soldiers of the cross.
So I can tell that some of you all want to sing. So earlier, some of you all wanted to dance. We all, at this table, they all want to dance. That's another event, right? So since we want to have you sing with us on our last thing, which is going to be Wade in the Water. There's kind of a little funny story about this. These guys went up to see the consecration of Bishop Shannon, which was a beautiful event. And they were all primed and ready to sing. And then this song never happened. So we said, well, we're going to do it. We're going to do it. And we're going to do it here. And we're going to invite you all to join us on the chorus of this, which is Wade in the Water, Wade in the Water. If you know it, please join us. They'll take the verses. And so let's get some good singing out there.
Wade in the water,
I'm gonna use. Oh. Oh, Lord.
Hold on a second, let me fix that.
There's a mishap. That's a mishap.
It was an appropriation. Divine appropriation. Yeah, maybe.
Wade in the water. That brought back memories of home, back down, the Baptist church. I remember singing, Wade in the water. I almost cried. Thank you. This is awkward. Why is it doing that? It's good now. Okay. I'm gonna make it work. Can y'all hear me? All right. Okay. So we have come to a special time in the evening where we are now going to hear our keynote speaker. But before that, I'm going to say a few words about him. Also, I've seen that you had Antioch on your, I don't know where that's at, but I'm also an Antioch person, so hey. So, Jonathan M. Smith was appointed Executive Director of the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Urban Affairs on July 1st, 2016. Immediately prior to joining the committee, Mr. Smith was the Associate Dean of Experiential and Clinical Programs at the University of the District of Columbia David A. Clark School of Law. Mr. Smith was the Chief of the Special Litigation Section of the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice from 2010 to 2015. The section was responsible for pattern of practice investigations of civil rights violations by law enforcement, correctional, juvenile justice, and mental health and developmental disability agencies. Under his leadership, the section conducted the civil investigation of the Ferguson, Missouri Police Department following the death of Michael Brown, which kind of speaks to his earlier talk. Prior to his government services, Mr. Smith was the Executive Director of the Legal Aid Society of the District of Columbia, the Public Service Center in Baltimore, Maryland, and the DC's Prisoners Legal Service Project. He's a bigwig, y'all. He's a bigwig. In each of these positions, in addition to providing program leadership, he has handled individual, class action, and implicit litigation, engaged in legislative advocacy, and in institutional reform efforts. That's a lot of big words in here. He started his career as an associate to Virginia civil rights lawyer Victor Glassberg. Some of his most recent publications, are Closing the Gap Between What is Lawful and What is Right in Police Use, Women and Children Escaping Violence Needing Support, Not Confinement, and Policing After Scalia. He thought the Fourth Amendment protected property, not people. Well, with all that, I now introduce Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Stephen. That was really wonderful. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. And let me start by congratulating everybody who had anything to do. Can people hear me?
Yes.
I'm worried about that. Not to replicate a Verizon commercial, but can you hear me now? Yeah. Anyway.
It's aimed up down, but it's hard to.
That better?
Yeah. Maybe we need to help before you're not.
Here you go. Let me do this. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
All right. Well, I won't touch it. I promise. But let me start by congratulating everybody who had anything to do with this really spectacular evening. I am, amazed at how many people have come out and what a wonderful crowd it is, and an extraordinary program that these young people have put on. So it's really my congratulations, and it's a remarkable night. And I know that. And I know that following my presentation, I'm in the way between the awards ceremony, and so I want to congratulate those who are going to receive awards later this evening. I won't have a chance necessarily to congratulate them and thank them, but I know that people done extraordinary work for which they're going to be honored tonight, so congratulations. It's really an honor to be here to join you for the first Freedom Fund dinner of the Windham County chapter of the NAACP. And I have to say, I'm particularly humbled and honored to have been asked to be here by Wiley Branton and Cliff Woods. And it really was very meaningful to me. At the Washington Lawyers Committee in DC, we have an event every year in which we honor members of our community who have done extraordinary work advancing civil rights, racial justice, and equal justice. And the highest award that we give each year is named after Wiley's father, Wiley Branton. And Wiley Branton served in the Johnson administration. He was dean of the Howard University Law School. He ran a federal voting rights project in the South that registered hundreds of thousands of African American voters. And he served on many boards and many organizations, including my board before my time, but the board of the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Urban Affairs. But Wiley Branton's legacy wasn't formed in Washington. His legacy was formed in Little Rock, Arkansas, where he was one of a small number of African American civil rights lawyers. And he was really a legend. And his legendary status was formed when he brought the cases that desegregated the Little Rock schools. And it was those cases that caused President Eisenhower to federalize the National Guard. And people will remember from your history books those famous pictures of the National Guard escorting African American students into school so that they could desegregate those schools. But less reported in the history books was Dean Branton's incredible courage and determinations in cases that didn't make it on the front page of the newspaper and didn't cause presidents to respond. There are legions of stories of Dean Branton being called in the middle of the night, rising from his bed and going to a local jail to get a black man released before the lynch mob or police ended his life. As we fight for racial equity, we stand on the broad shoulders of Wiley Branton and hundreds and thousands of other courageous men and women who sacrifice much and sometimes everything to achieve justice. When we come together like we do tonight, they are really among us. And the invitation I received tonight also was a letter from Stefan, and Stefan is left. He's somewhere. A letter from Stefan, in which he described the Freedom Fund dinner as hallowed ground. Now, I was really moved by that description. While I'm not a particularly religious man, I recognize that the work of racial and social justice is sacred work. It requires us to come together as a community and have faith in the goodness of each other. In the absence of that faith, the cause will be lost. I've had the privilege to spend my career working against racial and economic injustice. And while it's taken me to a wide range of cases and projects, the greatest portion of my time has been spent working to bring about change to our system of criminal punishment. I've had the honor to represent prisoners fighting to address abhorrent prison conditions, to work to change criminal laws to reduce incarceration, and to transform the way police departments deliver services. When I started to practice law, I looked to the great civil rights cases and appreciated the majesty of what the law could accomplish. I was convinced that through litigation, we would create a new world that was more fair and more just. I quickly learned that as essential as legal doctrine is, it is part of a much more complex puzzle. I learned that justice was far too often elusive. Our cases mattered, but did not always bring lasting change. I developed a growing appreciation for the power of communities and in organizing. The power of change does not lie exclusively in the law, but often that power is in the hands of people whose lived experience is injustice. None of the big cases happened in isolation, but all were part of a social movement. Brown versus Board of Education and any of the Sentinel civil rights cases would not have happened and would not have come out the way that they did if people had not been in the streets. And the NAACP has been a key organizer in that social movement. An early professional experience drove this point home to me. In my second semester of law school, I was hired to be a law clerk for a solo civil rights attorney in Alexandria, Virginia. He kept me on that summer, and I spent hundreds of hours interviewing prisoners in the Alexandria City Jail. It was an old dungeon of a jail. It was 200 years old. It had originally been built as a poorhouse. I met extraordinary men and women that summer and heard stories of unimaginable cruelty and horrifying conditions. My boss sued the jail, and in small part, based on my work, the jail was closed and a new modern facility was built. The harshest conditions of confinement were addressed, but the cruelty and insanity of the fact of incarceration was beyond the reach of our ability as litigators to address. Fast forward 35 years. By contrast, today, I'm serving on a commission that is looking at what to do in the old, falling down, dangerous DC jail. The conversation is completely different than it was when we sued the Alexandria City Jail. Because of activism, much of it led by people for whom the jail was their lived experience, we just issued a report calling for community investments, alternatives, and decarceration before building a new facility, and that any new construction be different and based on restorative justice principles. Now, before you think that the report was written by fuzzy-headed radicals, I suppose fuzzy-headed radicals defines me, the commission included the Deputy Mayor for Public Safety, a member of the DC Council, representatives of the United States Attorney's Office, representative of the DC Attorney General's Office, the head of the Department of Corrections, and the Guards Union. Because of organizing, activism, and advocacy, the conversation has fundamentally changed. I believe that we're at an inflection point in the nation's history. What we do in this particular moment matters. Dr. King told us that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And while I think that is true, the arc bends because we come together and we push on it. Unless we push, and we push hard, that arc can bend another way. That is the work we do on this hallowed ground tonight, and every day we join together to achieve justice. At any moment of change, it is nearly impossible to see the transformation that's underway. While change may appear inevitable, in retrospect, victory is very rarely clear at the time. The fog of the moment makes predicting the future difficult, and we are in the middle of that fog now. In the 1960s, young people who sat in at lunch counters, those who fought registered to vote, the civil rights warriors who integrated interstate buses and endured beating after beating, and the participants in the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge cannot have seen that within a few years, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act would become law, and the Thurgood Marshall, a founding member of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, would be sitting on the United States Supreme Court. They could not see that 65 years later, a black man named Barack Obama would be president of the United States. I'd be foolish not to recognize that there are many headwinds to change, and that these are perilous times. Donald Trump and the rise of the alt-right, and I just want to stop here from my notes for a minute. I hate the term alt-right. There's nothing alternative or right about them. It's simply a way to sanitize hate, and we should call them what they are. I mean, it is a racist movement. And it's a movement that's a frightening response to an African-American president and a movement for Black lives. But it is not just the headline-grabbing, overt racism that is sustaining and increasing inequality. As we see here tonight, as a nation, we have 5% of the world's population and 22% of the world's prisoners. The overwhelming majority of prisoners are black and brown, and the population of incarcerated women is rapidly growing. If you are African American, you are 5 times more likely to be arrested and jailed than if you're white. According to the Government Accountability Office, schools today are as racially segregated as the day that Brown versus Board was decided. In the District of Columbia, where I work, black kids go to what a study of the University of Southern California described as apartheid schools, schools that are 99 to 100% black. Racial housing segregation is on the rise. Wealth and income inequality based on race is growing more extreme. And it is easy and tempting to look at the persistence of racism and to despair. While we have much work to do, it is also critical to honor the sacrifice of those who have struggled and in some cases died for justice. There are many heroes and sheroes in the fight to create equality. And while some are well known, others are anonymous, and they did not sacrifice in vain. They brought the nation forward and closer to our professed ideals. We now carry their standard to continue the struggle. As you heard earlier, I had the honor to work as a career civil rights lawyer in the United States Department of Justice from 2010 to 2015. I led a group of lawyers charged with enforcing civil rights laws regarding policing, prisons, jails, juvenile justice, and other places of confinement. That work led me to cities and towns across the nation. During my tenure, we investigated 20 police departments in towns large and small, in the north, the south, the east, and the west, in Democratic cities and Republican cities. The first case I worked on was the New Orleans, Louisiana Police Department, and the last was the Police Department of Ferguson, Missouri. In each case, we conducted highly technical reviews of the department. We looked at policies and procedures and training. We interviewed officers at every level of the department. We conducted ride-ons and evaluated tens of thousands of stop and use of force and other reports. We tried to understand the department inside and out. But with the incredible support of Attorney General Holder and Assistant Attorney General Tom Perez and others in the administration, we also took our investigation into the community. We spent hundreds of hours in each city meeting with the diverse communities that make up every jurisdiction to learn how they experience policing. The technical review and the outreach was then reduced to a public report which described what facts we found, whether those facts violated the Constitution, and if they did, what remedy was required. We entered into more than 20 consent decrees, which are court orders for reform. Those reports also created a record that documented a crisis in policing across the nation. While each city was different, there were shockingly common themes. Laws are not enforced equally. Conduct that is criminalized in communities of color is treated as a social or medical problem in white communities. Communities of color mistrust police. They are over-policed and underserved. Not only do communities not trust police, but police do not trust communities. Without this trust, police and communities could not work together to create public safety. Patterns of unnecessary and excessive force are pervasive, especially against people of color. And there is a distinct lack of transparency and meaningful accountability. The other thing that I saw during my time at the DOJ was that there was an extraordinary movement underway. In every city, we found powerful, creative, and dedicated organizers, many of them as part of the NAACP, who are creating a vision of race equity built on the strengths found in the African American community. A movement that was sometimes covered in the press, but often most powerful, and often as its most powerful was happening at the grassroots and local level. It was also clear that this movement had a depth and sustainability that the media missed. That movement, for the first time in my life, felt like it posed a real challenge to the system of mass incarceration and presented a way forward. To explain what I mean, I'd like to take a brief detour into the history of mass incarceration. In 1967, there were uprisings in cities across the United States. Starting in Camden, New Jersey, and in Detroit, Michigan, African American communities were in rebellion. Dozens of inner cities burned. Following that summer, President Johnson appointed Otto Kerner, former governor of Illinois, to lead a commission to study the causes of the rebellion. The commission issued its famous report linking the uprisings to discrimination in housing, education, employment, and public services. Importantly, that report noted that each uprising started with an act of police violence. The report concluded that segregated urban neighborhoods were tinderboxes, and the spark that set off the conflagration was police violence. In 1967, the criminal legal system looked very different than it does today. Across the nation, there were only 200,000 people in prisons, and the vast majority of them were white. Under Jim Crow, prison wasn't necessary to enforce social order. Extrajudicial police practices ensured that African American suppression was maintained. Police failed to or participated in lynchings, took too few steps to protect the African American community from crime, and used force and threats of force rather than arrest or trial. In many states in the South, it was illegal for a black man to be idle during harvest season. Vagrancy laws allowed the police or sheriff to force black men into the fields or groves to pick crops. As Jim Crow was outlawed and the courts began to recognize the rights of African Americans, A new strategy was to develop to ensure social order and white supremacy. It started with the targeting of black liberation activists, the murder of Fred Hampton, and the spying on civil rights leaders as part of COINTELPRO. But it found its most durable strategy when in 1971, Richard Nixon demonized inner-city African-American communities and launched the war on crime. Nixon campaign official and White House advisor John Ehrlichman later confessed to the strategy of the Nixon administration. He was quoted in 1984 explaining, and I quote, this is a quote from John Ehrlichman, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana, blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about drugs? Of course we did." Mass incarceration was no accident. It was a plan, it was a strategy, it was a deliberate destruction of a community and a people. The political success of the Nixon strategy became national doctrine. In many places, even black politicians and black pastors supported harsher penalties. The criminalization of black people became a self-fulfilling prophecy. But making it a crime to be black, every black person in the eyes of the law became a criminal. The dramatic rise in incarceration ripped young black men from their homes, took away their opportunity to parent in impoverished communities, and created a cycle of pain, suffering, and incarceration. It justified the over-policing of black communities. From 1971 through the 2000s, the march of mass incarceration was relentless. This is not to say that there were not movements for change and organizing. Horrifying acts of police violence periodically led to moments of protest and calls for reform. Names like Eleanor Bumpers, Rodney King, Amadou Diallo, and others brought activists to the street. Every few years, an incident would bring resentment to the surface. In some cases, like the beating death of Arthur McDuffie in Miami, Florida, and the acquittal of the officers in the Rodney King beating, uprisings ensued, and these riots brought moderate reforms. Then things returned back to the way that they were. And each time that we as a nation failed to confront the brutality of our policing practices and our carceral system, the pressures continued to burn. During his famous I Have a Dream speech, Dr. King preached, "We have come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now." Dr. King went on to warn of the, quote, "rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual," end quote. If the nation did not, among other things, address, quote, "the unspeakable horrors of police brutality." Unfortunately, we did not heed Dr. King's words for more than 50 years. The reckoning came in the harm to communities of color. But all is not lost. Beginning in the 2000s, I believe something has changed. The country was shocked by the death of Trayvon Martin in 2012. In the wake of that killing, Black Lives Matter was conceived, and by three extraordinary African American women, Alicia Garza, Patricia Colliers, and Opal Tometi. They began to organize a movement in communities of color throughout the nation, joining with the NAACP and others. When Michael Brown died in 2016, the foundation had been laid, and Black Lives Matter moved to the front page of every newspaper in this country. But it was much, much more than the newspapers reported. The media understood Black Lives Matter as a protest movement. It is much more than that. It is a demand to look at the world differently, a demand to understand our history and the legacy of slavery and white supremacy, and understanding that 400 years ago this year, we took the first step to turn black bodies and black lives into a commodity, and that doing so reshaped the course of our nation's history. While the papers reported that Black Lives Matter movement was about changing policing, and it is, they failed to see that the movement is also about housing, education, opportunity, culture, health, and community. The rich intersectionality of the movement is often missed, but I think it is its power. And that is why I, for one, am hopeful. The NAACP, like no other organization, has led this struggle for decades. Despite the backlash of Trump and the alt-right, the conversation regarding racial equity has profoundly changed since the killing of Trayvon Martin. Across this nation, in cities and states, there's a real conversation about ending the criminalization of people of color. We see laws enacted that are reducing sentences, creating alternatives to incarceration, and fighting discrimination in housing and employment for those with a criminal record. In a few cities, as marijuana has been decriminalized, people who are harmed by the war on drugs are placed at the head of the line to run dispensaries and marijuana-related businesses, breaking the cycle that black people are punished by criminalization and white people profit by legalization. I want to close with the idea that ending mass incarceration is simply not enough. It is time to get serious about reparations. The reparations conversation far too often breaks down on whether white America needs to write black America a big check. I think that should be part of making right 40 years of shameful history, but it's not enough. We need to reckon with that history in a meaningful way. Prejudice and discrimination require real understanding and acknowledgement. People who look like me far too often try to take refuge in the fact that their ancestors didn't own slaves, or that they, quote, made it on their own. White privilege and white supremacy doesn't work that way. There's hard work that the white community must do to make, lost my notes. There's hard work that the white community must do, and at the core of it, it starts with confronting the truth. It has been a It's been a 400-year journey to get to where we are today. We have a long, hard road ahead. But being in a room like this tonight makes me feel confident that we are much closer to achieving racial justice than we were even a few years ago. I'm humbled and honored to be with you tonight. And even though we work in distant cities, we are joined in this fight together. Thank you very much.
How's everybody doing? Great. If it falls, we'll pretend like it needed to happen, okay? And together. All right, so the part we've all been waiting for. Do you have your raffle ticket?
That's funny.
All right, I'm kidding. All right. But at the same time, if you need raffle, Cliff is still taking dollar raffle tickets before this happens later, okay?
And I want to see names. I know y'all in here, so if I don't see a name, and y'all ain't on my membership list, I'm going to be coming. I will find you.
Okay, so since I was kidding, now we're moving. We are moving into the part of the awards of the night. Okay, so first we will start with the Community Courage and Action Award. The Community Courage and Action Award represents the fiercest justice warriors among us, the truly fearless. These are the people who put their money where their mouth is, showing up time and time again for their community. They are in the trenches, selflessly fighting in the messiest halls and injustice, so that the rest of us don't have to do it. And some of us do it in heels. So yeah, thank you, people. Not only are the recipients of this award legendary, their actions also drive us to show up as our best, most authentic selves. We truly appreciate these real change agents. We call up Sheila Lenton. is a Black, Indigenous, queer racial justice advocate, activist, and community organizer. She was born here in Brattleboro, Vermont, where she has laid her roots with her own children over the past 25 years. Sheila has a long history of disturbing and dismantling the structure of white supremacy culture in her community, home state of Vermont, and globally. Sheila is a co-founder of the Root Social Justice Center and a co-coordinator of the Root programming I Am Vermont 2, Soul Food Sundays, Families United, Youth for Change, and the Black Indigenous People of Color Caucus. And she's doing all of that with a focus to support the various needs of people, particularly non-white folks in the region and state, and to continue to grow a movement for racial accountability, healing, justice, and liberation. Sheila is the co-development liaison for the newly formed statewide People of Color Caucus, and in 2018, she helped lead the first ever Vermont statewide People of Color Caucus retreat with a focus on building relationships among POC, healing together, and developing POC caucuses around the state of Vermont. Sheila is also appointed by the Vermont Attorney General to serve on the Racial Disparities and Criminal and Juvenile Justice System Advisory Panel as one of the voices for communities of color around the state, addressing white supremacy and disparate treatment of people of color, particularly Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks in our juvenile, criminal justice, and DCF systems. She's doing a lot. She makes her 24 hours work. Sheila is a supporter of the Ethnic Studies Coalition and is an advocate for families statewide who have been impacted by the DCF system and are fighting to have families' voices heard, and for Vermont DCF to be accountable for those families in our communities. Sheila is a public speaker and has spoken at dozens of events, ranging from speaking in front of 1,000 people at the Vermont State House to being keynote speaker at Goddard College to being a direct action leader in Paris for the COP21 Accord. Ooh. Sheila continues her work outside of direct activism and advocacy as a co-founder of Equity Solutions, a working cooperative where she works as a trainer and consultant, addressing the larger system of capitalism as it intersects with white supremacy. She is also a trainer and consultant with ACT for social justice, providing advocacy, training, and consulting to raise consciousness about power and advantage related to race and class. Sheila is a proud GMA? She's a GMA, y'all, of a 2-year-old grandbaby, and is a proud, angry Black woman. Congratulations, Sheila and Ted. Awesome, that's so great. I put it all in my bio so I would talk less. So I was gonna write, well, I'm just gonna take the mic because that's how I do. I was gonna write something down, but you all have bougie napkins here, so it's not on paper, so I had to pull something out of my purse. So I'm gonna pretend like I'm at the Grammys and they're gonna take me off with the music, so I'm gonna do this really fast.
But I wanted to just say a few things because, first of all, I wanted to say that when I was a little girl hearing about the NAACP, I always looked up to that organization because it was an organization that I believed that was fighting for my people. And when I say my people, I mean people who look like me, brown and black people. And so I didn't know I was an activist or a community organizer or an advocate when I was a child. But as I grew older, I realized how these organizations were important in the foundation of creating who I am today. So I want to thank Stefan, and I want to thank Rose and Nader, and especially the two of you, Stefan and Rose, for your leadership in creating this NAACP chapter, and to thank our sister organization, Rutland, Tabitha Moore, for being aligned and creating it too. I really give them a round of applause. Years ago, I was one of the people who tried to form an NAACP here, and Vermont was not having it. I'm not the only person who tried to do that. And I'm so appreciative to all of you who have come forth, who have supported this initiative, both the brown and black folks in the room and the white folks as well, and I'm so, so thankful. So just one more minute, I want to give shout outs to, first of all, I want to give shout outs to my Lord and my Savior God. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here. Thank you so much. And for those of you who are not in that higher power, whatever higher power it is, have you believe in that for yourselves as well. And so I want to first say that my parents are here. My parents are here. So over there, raise your hands, mommy and daddy, raise your hands. That's who made me. That's who made me. And I want each and every one of you to know who made me. Because that means a lot to me. And I also want to recognize my auntie Leah, who's in the house. She helped raise me. These are the people who raised me. And so if you respect me, respect them. If you support me, support them. So I want to also say thank you to my children. I have one of my childs in the room today. The other one is at work. I want to say thank you for all the support and sacrifice that my children have given me to be the activist, to be the advocate, and to be the community organizer that all of you are supporting here up on the stage. And then I want to, yes, the youth, yes. And then I want to say thank you to my extended family who came here, not only to support the youth, but Haven and Delphine and all of the Root community. I want to give a shout out to the Root Social Justice Center. Thank you so much for all of your support. Yeah, okay, this is the last thing I'm going to say. So this was a Courage in Action Award, which I didn't read until I saw the pamphlet, so I didn't really know what I was coming up here for. So what I want to say is that my courage is not my choice, but by necessity. I need each and every one of you to understand that. This is an award of courage and action, and my courage is not by choice. It is by necessity. I want people to also understand that my action is not only out of necessity, but it's also out of my survival. And I ask you to continue to help me in my survival. Thank you. And she left the award behind.
So, under her leadership and mentorship, we recognize tonight 2 young people for the Youth in Action Courage Award. We call up Royalty Ricardo. Royalty is an 18-year-old queer Black Latinx person, and they've spent their time in Brattleboro working in the Root Social Justice Center. They've been awarded by Camp Outright for being a youth activist, and they've spoken at many events. Royalty has been a speaker at Montpelier and has gone to many school meetings to speak on behalf of the people of color students in their school. Royalty's main goal is to teach POC youth that they are connected with and to be a role model for these said children. Royalty cannot wait to see the future and what it brings to them.
Congratulations, Rose. I'm gonna start crying. I'm very emotional. This award means so much to me. I haven't been a youth activist for very long. It's been a very confusing and hard 2 years being in this work. I have learned so much about myself that I didn't realize was missing about me. And so I want to say thank you to The Root for being there and for existing, for me to be able to grow as a person. I want to thank my parent, Fisher, who has just recently adopted me, which is a huge deal. I want to thank my auntie Sheila for always believing in me. But I mostly thank myself for being able to put myself out here and put myself on the line like I've never had before for children that are after me. That is my legacy. Thank you.
And up next, we are bringing to the stage Z. Mohammed. Z is a youth activist primarily focused on racial justice work within the Brattleboro community, mainly at the Root Social Justice Center. Z is one of the founders of Youth for Change, a youth activism group at the Root on action, education, and arts. Z went to Brattleboro Union High School, where they had honors and were a part of restorative justice in the AWARE Club. AWARE is a group focused on students of color to be represented and to educate the school on issues of multiculturalism, racism, and intolerance. Through this group, they helped raise the Black Lives Matter flag on the middle and high school campus. They have traveled doing workshops around racial justice in the group as well. In the restorative justice program, Z facilitated circles to work towards breaking the cycle of the school to prison pipeline. Z now attends Community College of Vermont as a senior in high school and is planning on going to college next year. Congratulations. Z also identifies as an artist who uses many media forms ranging from spoken word, poetry, film, pottery, and the visual arts like painting, drawing, and collage. Congratulations, Z. Mohammed.
I also just want to point out, I know that the people from Landmark had to leave. Their shuttle left at 8:30. Mark Thurman was here, and I wish he could hear this because we have to talk about how important mentorship is. I just turned 30, but Mark was my first student at Landmark College, and now he is a diversity coordinator. And so it doesn't matter how young you are, it doesn't matter how young they are. Mentorship matters, and it makes huge impact. So, the next awardees that we have are for the Lifetime Achievement Award, our most prestigious award, and one that is only given to people who have a lifetime. I'm not calling you old. Look at Mary over there like, what? Not me. The Lifetime Achievement is the highest award that a branch can bestow. It is reserved for members of the community who have spent several generations of their life fighting for the betterment of society and the equity of others. This award is special, not only because it's bestowed on so few, but also because it says to the recipient that we appreciate you, we see your body of work, we are impressed by your body of work, and we would like to collectively honor it. The current winners of this award come from various backgrounds and professional fields. Dottie is a former psychologist and diversity officer at Keene State. Mary is a professor at Smith. Lisa is a pastor. And Curtis is a statewide equity trainer. While each person is powerful on their own, it is their collective bodies of work that have helped make our community so powerful. At this moment, I would like to call the first awardee forward. Mary Gannon, please come forward, please. Mary's my friend. But we wasn't biased though. I'm serious. It was a long process, y'all. Woo! Okay. You standing there? Okay. I'm going to read her bio now. Dr. Mary Gannon has been involved in social justice activism, teaching, and training for over 30 years. She began her own anti-racism education exploration of her white racial identity in college and was fortunate to continue this work as a graduate student in the social justice education program at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She credits her depth of knowledge and practice in the field of racial and social justice to the program's rigorous curriculum, alongside of brilliant faculty and mentors who were generous with their wisdom, intellect, presence, and love. Mary has extensive experience as a trainer, consultant and facilitator in the fields of anti-racism, social justice education, and multicultural organizational development. Her teaching, training, and consulting philosophy is grounded in a framework of dismantling all forms of white supremacy culture using principles of humanistic education, critical race theory, and liberatory practice. She has engaged with school districts and professional education associations, state and municipal government agencies, state and local law enforcement agencies, mental health care agencies, and nonprofits, and more. Mary believes in the possibility of local and state partners working collectively to develop institutional policies and practices that will respond more effectively to the impact of racism and other forms of white supremacy across the state. Mary has the strongest interest in supporting the development of community coalitions across the state of Vermont, whereas these issues can be addressed using sustainable strategies and the representation of all voices. Recently, she has worked with the town of Stowe VT, supporting their efforts to craft a strategy with the community and municipal stakeholders to develop a community coalition. The Racial Equity Alliance of Lamoille is now working to address racism and other forms of bigotry in the community schools and municipal branch. Dr. Gannon maintains associate adjunct professor status at Smith's College School for Social Work, where she has taught courses on racism and institutional discrimination. She is a founding member of the Community Equity Collaborative in Brattleboro, whose mission is to support the greater Brattleboro area dismantling prejudice and discrimination of all kinds. I would also like to add about Mary that, and one of the reasons why our executive committee made the decision that we did is because a lot of people do not know the immense impact that Mary has had on multiple people of color's lives as they've come to Vermont to transition. It can be a rough transition. She has been there for many colleagues of mine from various racial and ethnic backgrounds, working silently and never ever asking for any reward. And we appreciate that, and we see that. And I am so humbled to give you this award, and have you come up if you want to say something.
Thank you all. So very quickly, because I know that you've all been here for a long evening and I've been just blown away by this evening, so I'm so honored to be a part of it. But when Stefan first called me and said, hey, we want to nominate you for this Lifetime Achievement Award. Of course, the first thing I said was, well, I'm only 54. Like, damn. And I also said to him, honestly, I said, you know, remember, I'm a white person. So we have a little joke about that because, again, I'm someone also who grew up knowing about the NAACP, grew up in South Boston at a time when there were a lot of very difficult issues with race riots in the schools, and it was a really challenging time to be living in South Boston. And but always knew about the NAACP and wondered, you know, what my work would be as I kind of entered into the world of social justice. So I am very deeply humbled, you know, receiving this award as somebody who does identify as white is an honor that I don't take lightly. And I really want to say that I feel like I'm here tonight because of the collective of justice workers who are here in this room, many who are not here, and those who came before me. So I am, as a recipient of this award, I take it seriously and take my responsibility to carry on this work in the spirit of the founders of the NAACP and its mission. I also want to say there are many giants in this room who are colleagues and friends who have allowed me to stand on their shoulders and have guided me in ways that are invaluable to my work and have gotten me here to this moment, who have modeled patience, who have held me accountable at times when it was incredibly uncomfortable as a white person working through my own understanding of race and racism and white supremacy culture, and have taught me invaluable lessons. And I think you know who you are. I also have to do a quick shout out to three people who, when I look back on my ability to really be where I am now, Dr. Barbara Love, who was a graduate faculty of mine at UMass, who does amazing work now across the nation and internationally. Dr. Bailey Jackson, who was one of the first theorists and scholars around racial identity development and Black identity development with Bill Cross. I learned a lot from the both of them. And also Dr. Deborah Robinson, who was a new colleague of mine at the School for International Training. I had the very privilege and honor of working with her for a short time. And those are some folks that I wish could be here tonight with us, but I want to also appreciate them. So I'm very grateful. Thank you all very much.
So this next person, well, working in civil rights, you become friends with all the civil rights people, so everybody my friend, but but I will say this next person, I am so happy and humbled to offer this award to a Miss Dr. Dottie Morris. Would you please come up? Dottie. Where the award at? No, just joking. Thank you, Liz. So, Dr. Dottie Morris. Dr. Dottie Morris is currently the Associate Vice President of Institutional Diversity and Equity at Keene State College. As the Associate Vice President for Institutional Diversity and Equity, Dr. Morris is a member of the Keene State College's Presidential Cabinet. Her main role is to collaborate with the President and Vice Presidents as the institution establishes strategies and practices to co-create an environment deeply rooted in the principles of equity, diversity, and social justice. Dr. Morris received her PhD in clinical psychology from Washington State University, an MA in counseling psychology from Texas Southern University, and a BA in psychology from Dillard University. Well, you've been studying folks for a long time. It's a long time. I gotta hide everything. For nearly 30 years, Dr. Morris has worked with the undergraduate and graduate students as a counselor, teacher, academic advisor, and advisor of student groups. She has demonstrated continuous dedication and devotion to diversity, equity, multiculturalism, and social justice over the past 2 decades. Prior to her current position at Keene State, she served as the Associate Dean for Student Learning at World Learning School for International Training Institute. You did? Oh. And Director of Student Affairs for the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Program at Antioch University, New England. Okay. She been where I be. So, that's fun. And staff psychologist at the Colorado State University Counseling Center and the coordinator of the Employee Assistance Program. She is the recipient of several awards, including the 2019 Martin Luther King Award, New Hampshire YWCA Hero for Justice, the Counselor for Social Justice Ohana Award, and Outstanding Women of New Hampshire Award, because she gets across the borders, y'all. She was appointed to the New Hampshire Governor Council on Equity and Inclusion and serves as co-chair. She was recognized by U.S. Senator Maggie Hassan for her contributions to the state of New Hampshire. She is currently serving on several boards, including New Hampshire ACLU, Leadership New Hampshire, and Cope Kind Nonprofit Educational Foundation. And she is a proud native of Louisiana and currently resides in the South. Well, some few Louisianians in here, okay. I also want to add, because I always add my own 2 cents, because that's me, that, okay, Rose, I want to get the time together. I know how you are. I also just wanted to add that Dottie has been another person who has been very special to a lot of the people of color who come from other states and want to make Vermont their home. The transition is rough. When I first met her, I felt like her eyes were on me. She sought me out in a way. The energies connected, and she has been a strong supporter, advocate, and ally ever since. Dottie will go to war for any young person of color. If they need her, she's coming. She's an ally, and we can always call on her. And I really do appreciate you. We all appreciate you. And so, yeah.
When Stefan called me, I was driving, and I thought I had a bad connection. So I literally had to pull over because I was so, I felt so honored, and I was humbled by the award. So I want to start off by thanking the Windham NAACP for this great award. As I was sitting on the side of the road, I had a flash of someone who was very important to me. When I was a little girl, I couldn't wait to be in the Sunday school class of this one person. Her name was Rupert Clemens. Rupert Clemens went on to work with the National NAACP. And I had a flash of her smiling face and her encouragement and some of the things that she taught me in that Sunday school class about justice and about her understanding of what we should do as people of faith. So I couldn't get her out of my mind. I sat on the side of the road for quite some time, just reflecting on her. So as with other people, none of us make it to where we are alone. The other thing that I had to come to terms with is when I get an award, I feel like my mother's voice is in the back of my head saying, why should you get an award for things you should do anyway? And so I really do believe that, I do these things because I feel as though I've been called to do it, and to do anything less would be negating my responsibility. So I always ask questions instead of giving answers. So I have a couple questions. How do we develop new strategies and tools to confront the system deeply embedded in white supremacy? And I often think about Audre Lorde's words, that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So in thinking about how we do these things, we have to think about those new tools. We have to think about how to do this. And how do we co-create a different reality? And so then I channeled Winona LaDuke when she says, we don't want a bigger piece of the pie. We want a different pie altogether. So as I think about all of these people and all of these words and all of the giants, I'm standing on their shoulders. I have to say, I am not worried about the future. I wish I could sing, because I would sing, I don't feel no ways tired. I often think of myself as an emerging elder and a future ancestor. And I'm very proud that I will occupy both of those spaces at some point in time. But I always say that I don't feel tired because people didn't know Maddie. People didn't know Dorothy or Fleming Sr., or all of those who went before me, who faced times as tough as we're facing them now. And they did, in fact, make a difference. So for each one of us, we have to realize that we are called to do great things. And we can't do it in a way that makes us become the very thing that we despise. Amen. I refuse to allow anyone to make me engage in a way that's against my own humanity. So I beg you today that we don't dehumanize people, regardless of how horrible they are. You maintain your integrity and your humanness in the process of fighting the battle. I beg you to do that. That's the only way out of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. That was very moving. We have two more awardees. I know it's getting late, and we're going to get through these two here. And I'm very excited to be able to read the biographies of these two folks. So would Reverend Lisa Sparrow please come up? So according to family lore, Lisa spent the first 2 weeks of her life crying and cradled in the arms of Rebecca Allen, an older African-American woman who had worked for and continued to work for her family intermittently from the time her mother was a child and well into Lisa's years as a teen. Allen was a larger-than-life person who had lived a far more interesting life than anyone Lisa had met before, and with whom Lisa credits and thanks for a lifelong commitment to working with and among people of different races and traditions. Growing up in California's North Bay area, Lisa attended racially diverse schools and received her fair share of cross-racial punches and bruising. So much so that as a student at Cal Berkeley in the 60s, she was fascinated by the civil rights movement and studied sociology under Professor Harry Edwards, the architect of the Olympic Project for Human Rights, which led to the Black Power Salute protest by two African-American athletes at the 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico City. Fascinated by the complexities of racism and slavery, she worked and traveled as a graduate student in Liberia and Sierra Leone, and later in Kenya and Uganda, and was an early supporter and friend to Wangari Maathai, who later went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize for her work in environmental justice. As a professor at the School for International Training, she taught courses in culture, identity, and ethnic diversity, and with a doctorate in multicultural education from the University of Massachusetts, created some of the first courses and programs in diversity education at SIT. After 25 years at SIT, she turned in 2000 to local issues of poverty and justice. As a local pastor, she has since worked with local schools supporting programs for diversity and restorative justice and created the Brattleboro Area Interfaith Youth Project, which has traveled to Montpelier and Washington, D.C. in protest, and has also given local teens the opportunity to serve as volunteers locally in Kenya and on the Cheyenne River Reservation in South Dakota as a means of instilling an understanding of the interconnectedness of all persons. Her deepest commitment is to providing young people the opportunity to work across racial, gender, and ethnic boundaries. As the diversity chairperson for the United Church of Christ in Vermont, Lisa has worked both on a statewide level and locally with churches and other faith communities to weave racial justice into conferences and events, and was a founding member of the Community Equity Collaborative, which was formed by local activists and leaders after racist events in 2009. She takes humbly and to heart her obligation as a white person to learn from and support people of color, and believes there are others far more deserving of this award. She claims she was literally born into the work of racial justice, and claims it was a source and claims it as a source of infinite love and learning in her life. So congratulations, Lisa. Thank you.
Nobody needs to speak after Dottie. I wrote something to thank people, but I don't know I'll get through it. But I am so honored and so thrilled. I think, Stefan, you charmed the NAACP existence here in Brattleboro. Look at this. It's amazing. It's fantastic. Thank you all so much. I did the same thing Dottie did. He called me, I was driving, I pulled over, I cried. Then we went out of service, and that was the end. But, I'm also very humbled to be among all of you, many of whom I've worked with in so many ways in Brattleboro, and we know that we did this all together, that somehow, somewhere we did it, and I usually try to not be the person here, so I just, you know that I love you. I also want to particularly thank a few people. As I said, we said in the bio, 20 years ago I decided to come off the SIT hill and walk my talk in Brattleboro, and went to a little church in Guilford, and I'm so grateful to Curtis and to Sherry Ann Broadhurst, to Sheila Linton, and to Blessed and anyway, other people of color who came to worship with me so that we could do this work together, because without you it wouldn't have happened. I want to also do, it's interesting, I guess Dottie and I shared the same, I have to say when I got this, I just started feeling this cloud of witnesses, and I for the first time really talked about Becky, who took care of me as a child. But I also want to talk about my high school experience just very briefly. There are 3 people. I was in a very diverse high school, and Barbara Smith came before Sparrow. So in those days we would always sit in alphabetical order, and in gym we would also always have our lockers next to each other. And Barbara Smith was from Richmond, California, and she was African American, and I was Lisa Sparrow, and I lived up the hill a little bit and was white, and every day we would sit next to each other. I never really got to know her. And yet for 4 years we sat next to each other every day, and I have to say that every time I am in a setting like this, she's with me. It's as if we are in this together, and I have no idea what happened to her, but Barbara, I am here. The second person is Emmett O'Neill, who was the first black male cheerleader at our school, which is a big deal, and I now look back and realize that he, of course, was gay as well. But he took me to the senior prom. So I figured it was my first GLBTQ moment, and I think of him all the time. And finally, just to kind of talk about one other person who I think of is Jerry Martin, who was one of my closest friends, an African American man, and he stopped speaking to me in college because he became a black Muslim. So I just want him to know out there that I'm still there for him, even though if he left me in the dust, but that's okay. Anyway, I talk about those 3 people because I think they taught me how complex race, class, gender, all those things are, and that it's a fascinating thing. And in my church, I think I learned the truth in a more intimate, private relationship of how exhausting it is to be a person of color in a white state like this. How exhausting and how unpredictable it is. And every time I get tired, I just think, I don't know the half of it, I don't know the tenth of it, I don't know the thousandth of it. So that inspires me to go on. So I just, again, say how humble I am to receive this. I'm really old, so it is the end of my life. So there you go. I think you had to slip it in. You had to slip it to me before. That's right. I had to get it in. So thank you all so much. Anyway, that's it.
Okay, so we are on our last awardee, certainly not least, Curtis Reed. It's my understanding that he's not here tonight. He wasn't able to make it, but Gemma will be accepting the award on his behalf, and he also has an acceptance video that will be playing here momentarily. So Curtis Reed, Jr. has spent his life fighting to establish environments that recognize, value, support, nurture, and provide justice for marginalized groups. His journey began as a child in St. Louis, fighting Jim Crow racism, followed by 2 decades of social and economic justice work in international arenas. For the past 20 years, his work is focused on Vermont. As executive director, Reed transformed the then hyper-local Alana Community Organization into Vermont Partnership for Fairness and Diversity, Vermont's go-to statewide social justice organization for addressing the challenges of and harnessing the power and creativity inherent in Vermont's increasingly diverse population. Reed is a recognized thought leader throughout northern New England and upstate New York. His work ranges from co-founding a regional community equity collaborative, delivering implicit bias training for law enforcement and school communities, conducting equity audits for municipalities, authoring a citywide diversity-driven strategic plan for the city of Burlington, convening annual Vermont Vision for a Multicultural Future conferences, and creating the Vermont African American Heritage Trail. Interesting. Inclusion and equity have become both the means and the end in his practice of applied social justice. Building relationships of trust has produced substantive changes in Vermont law enforcement, education, commerce, and human services delivery, as well as state and municipal government use of inclusive and equitable practices in Vermont's increasingly diverse cultural landscape. While skillful in the use of inquiry as a subversive activity, Reed is a humble, gracious, and compassionate mentor and role model. Reed serves as the chair of the Vermont Advisory Committee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights, where he has been a member intermittently since 2004. Under his leadership, the committee's groundbreaking report on racial profiling brought substantive changes in the practice of law enforcement in Vermont. He is a member of the Vermont Department of Education, Harassment, Hazing, and Bullying Prevention Advisory Council, a founding member of Vermont Independent Media Publisher of the award-winning Commons newspaper, and a former member of the New England Board of Higher Education Blue Ribbon Task Force on the participation of underrepresented minorities in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. In May 2015, the School for International Training Graduate Institute conferred upon Reed an honorary doctorate of humane letters for his work strengthening Vermont as an inclusive and equitable destination for all. Reed, a former United States Peace Corps volunteer, has lived or worked in or traveled to over 40 countries during 18 consecutive years as an expatriate. He lives in Brattleboro, and when time permits, bicycles and cross-country skis. Reed is the father of 3 adult children and married to Catherine Griffith. So congratulations, Curtis, even though he wasn't able to make it tonight, and looks like we have a video almost ready. There.
Good evening. I am joining you tonight in spirit from Cuba, where I am celebrating the 500th anniversary of the founding of the city of Havana. I would be there with you tonight if it was not for my non-refundable tickets that I purchased months ago. As my father would say, I know everyone there is looking good and feeling good. And in fact, why don't you turn to your neighbor and with all the gusto you can muster, so that I can hear you here in Cuba, I want you to say, I'm looking good and feeling good. And more importantly, you are doing good by supporting the important work of the NAACP. My earliest recollection of the organization was in 1950 St. Louis as an asthmatic child sitting in Dr. Cicadan Hill's office. Posted on the wall in her dimly lit waiting room was an NAACP poster that read, "Don't talk politics here unless you are registered to vote." Dr. Hill, a short but nonetheless imposing black pediatrician, meant business. In addition to building strong bodies, she and her NAACP poster were building the foundation for racial justice back in the day. While much has changed since the 1950s, much remains to be done. I am humbled and honored to be the recipient of the NAACP Lifetime Achievement Award from the Windham County, Vermont chapter of the NAACP. My only hesitation in accepting this award is the uncomfortable acknowledgement to myself that I am aging faster than I want. Be that as it may, I am exceedingly proud of brilliant, dedicated, and conspicuously courageous young bloods like Stefan and Tabitha. Again, thank you for the honor of the Lifetime Achievement Award, and may we all continue to look good and feel good as we do good on behalf of racial and social justice. Thank you.
Yeah. So quickly, just want to apologize that we've gone a little past 9. We are going to be done very soon, and next year we will make sure to be a little quicker. And we also want to acknowledge that the governor did send a letter. I wanted to acknowledge that. Oh, we're not going to read it, don't worry. But he did send a letter. And we also have Peter Elwell in the House, our town manager, which we... Sheila, where are you going? Sheila, you can't go nowhere. Okay. Because we need y'all to take a picture at some point. All of y'all. So, the awardees, not all of y'all. The awardees. I gotta tighten up my language. I gotta tighten it. Can y'all come up now? Look at Rose giving me orders. All the awardees, can y'all come up now, please? And then after that, we are going to have a raffle. Clifford, where you at, Cliff? We need you for the raffle so we can get up out of here soon. Can we give these awardees one more round of applause, please? Run, Sheila, run, man. I'm just joking. You gotta run.
Now it's raffle time. Get your tickets out. Tickets out. Come on.
Okay. Well, I haven't used the mic yet, so I hope I don't suck at it. Could you pass me shake the tickets? We'll do the book first. The jars are small. I'm glad you're doing it. The first number is 337026. 337026. We have a winner.
That's my clinic director, everybody.
So the next one's going to be the teddy bear, which Stefan's holding. So. It's a discount off a teddy bear. It's not an actual teddy bear. The next one is 337071. Okay, that sounded almost too close to level. Congratulations. And then I'll take the last one. That's the last one. The gift certificate. We don't need this. And the last one is for the 4 tickets to the Weston Playhouse Theater Company. And the winner is 337049. 337049. Yeah, come on. Okay. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for supporting the raffle. And up next is Kaya Morris for Reflections. So.
Thank you, everyone. What a night. What a night. I know it's been a long one. There's been a lot of things going on, but you all have been here and you've stuck through it, and that's so important. So I just want to thank you all for that. So my name's Kaya Morris, and I'm really proud and pleased to be able to be here for the first, and not the last, Freedom Fund for the Windham County NAACP. Something that we didn't have a chance to do, but it's never too late to do so. I just want to acknowledge that today we are gathered on occupied Abenaki lands. And so while there have been many different indigenous tribes that have lived, worked, and communicated through these lands, we mostly recognize the Western Abenaki. And it's important for us to recognize their history and their genocide, but they're still here within us and within our state, and a vibrant part of our state, and so we should always recognize where we are and that we are just guests on this. We also need to give big ups to both chapters of the NAACP, because as we said, people have been trying to create this space, trying to create this voice, trying to create the people power that's necessary to show that people of color are here. So while we hope with our best of intentions that this next census count will be successful, which it will only do so with the help of many people, know that we've been here, we've always been here, we will always be here. But it is through the declaration of our humanity and the requirement that there's a recognition of our civil rights and our right to be here in this state that we're able to continue having the vibrancy we need. And it is through the strength, the history, and the courage of those leaders, of our NAACP chapters, and of the members that are here, that's how we're able to get this done. Okay. I want you also to remember that it's not just a night to have some chicken. Right? This is also a fundraiser, so feel free to write checks of any amount. Feel free to go on ahead and sign up before you leave if you are not currently a member, because there's no excuse for it. Your ticket does not count. And be sure to stay involved with this really, really powerful work. If you are able to, there is something else that I feel is very, very important, because we have a new generation that is needing for us to show them how important this work is and how much we're going to need them to continue on. You heard Curtis say, oh, we got our new young bucks coming through, and I'll never forget a conversation that the 3 of us actually, I think it was Tabitha, myself, Stefan, that we all had with him, where he was like, I feel comfortable passing on the torch now. I feel like we're in a good place. We have youth here today who not only perform for us, but who won awards. If you are able, can you please rise to your feet and acknowledge our youth that are here, because it's so important that you know that they are absolutely the future. Please recognize them for their talent. Please recognize them for their passion. Thank you. And of course we want to acknowledge our awardees too, right? There's some incredible people who've been doing work on the ground here in this state, and everything happens in a movement and a time. We need things to move at the exponential rate that they are moving at. But we would not have the momentum to get this work going further if it was not for those people who have laid that foundation for us. Amen. And so for me, I know that I stand on the shoulders, and we all stand on the shoulders of so many who have been screaming to the tops of their lungs until their voices are hoarse, and have been in too many damn spaces where their stories are dismissed, where too many times where the actual lived realities that clearly matches the data points on all of those charts that determine what gets importance and what does not get importance in our lives and in our government, that we have an obligation to continue to press on. And that we need for some of our most beautiful white comrades to sometimes step aside, take up a little less space, and if we are there, to listen and to learn, and to sit with the discomfort of the fact that this is really hard work. It's not going to be pretty, but it has to happen. It's for all of our survival, and it's very, very necessary. So, I'm encouraging y'all to continue out there and raise hell. I need y'all youth to continue to raise lots of hell and hold us incredibly accountable. We got work to do. We got work to do. So thank you all for being here tonight. Don't leave without cutting the check. Don't leave without telling a neighbor what we have to do next. And I do hope that you will carry the power of this evening in your hearts. So thank you all for being here. Oh, there's something more. But wait, there's more. We already took it out. Oh, here's a Benedict.
Oh, okay.
That's not me.
So next, we would introduce. Oh, okay.
No need for another announcement. Okay. So now I'm going to pray and bless us. Well, I'm not going to bless, but I'm going to call it down. Us out of here. Oh God, who created all peoples in your image, we thank you for the wonderful diversity of races and cultures in this world. We give thanks for this time of celebration and the work that has gone into this evening. Bless the work being done through the Windham County, Vermont branch of the NAACP. May we all grow in our dedication to serving the needs and promoting the social, economic, political, and interpersonal power of people of color and their allies wherever we call home. Lastly, we pray that you would enrich our lives by ever-widening circles of fellowship and show us your presence in those who differ most from us, until our knowledge of your love is made perfect in our love for all your children. May this be so through the God of peace and love. Amen. Oh, we're going to sing. How about if you stand? Your voices sound, but if you're able, you sound better when we stand.
thank you all so much for coming, and we hope you had a wonderful night. Come again next year, and we will see you soon.